Today I'm talking to you about the fruits of Grinling Gibbons, which you can see behind me. And to start off with, I want to give you a brief introduction to the mirror and the frame under which we are standing. The frame is, with some certainty, although not 100%, ascribed to Grinling Gibbons. It is said to have come from Fitzharris Manor, although there's no proof of that, and it has been in the town council's possession since about 1860. The frame didn't always hold a mirror. At some point it had a portrait of the monarch in it, whichever monarch it would have been at the time, and at some point it was gilded as well, but then afterwards the gilding was taken off again to restore its original pure lime wood appearance. There is a theory that the frame was adapted from a panel, so that it wasn't made as a frame for anything. But again, it's not certain. It's a theory one of the experts who looked at this has come up with. There's no documentation really of the frame's past at all, so it's impossible to be certain about anything. Second, I'm going to say a brief word about the artist Grinling Gibbons, who he was, what he did. Got a picture of him here. And there he is. He lived from 1648 to 1721, and his unusual name, Grinling, is probably a corruption of his mother's maiden name, which was Gorlings. He was born in Rotterdam, but his parents were English. His father was a draper, and his mother came from a family of merchants who were resident in Rotterdam. And Gibbons lived in Holland until he was about 19 or 20. Started his training, possibly completed his training there, and then came to England. He started his career in York, but very soon moved to London. His skill as a carver was recognized when he was still quite a young man, and it was recognized by people including King Charles II. He appointed him as surveyor and repairer of carved work at Windsor Castle. And this is a position he retained under subsequent kings and queens as well. In 1693, he was also appointed Master Sculptor and Carver in Wood to the Crown. That's his official title. And places he worked at include Whitehall, St. James's Palace, Kensington Palace, Hampton Court, St. Paul's Cathedral, Blenheim Palace. Of course, Gibbons didn't do all this work on his own. He had a workshop, or possibly several workshops with teams of carvers working with him. And this is one of the reasons for the uncertainty about the origin of this frame, since it's not signed by the artist like a painting would be. It has been assumed in the past that this was made in one of his workshops by his team in the style of Grinling Gibbons. And it's only been more recently that experts have come round to the view that it is probably Gibbons himself who carved this frame. And I've only sort of reeled off this list of palaces and fabulous places to show you the status that Gibbons had as a carver in this country, because the people who owned these places and who commissioned the carvings, they wouldn't have hired just anyone. They would have wanted the best, and they could afford the best, and they went for Gibbons, so clearly he was the best. Now, the reason I've chosen to talk about this mirror for Heritage Week is because of this year's theme, Edible England. If you look at the carving, there's quite a bit that's edible on there. There's peaches at the top, there's currants all around, there's some wheat at the top as well, there are plums, and there's a pea pod in the corner there as well. So I looked at this and I asked myself, why all this fruit? And it's not the only carving by Gibbons that has fruit and vegetables and other edible things in it. So it's clearly a theme that goes through his work. So what might have inspired Gibbons to include all these fruits in his carving? And I think there are two reasons, two things going on in the wider world of arts and architecture at the time, which have influenced him. Gibbons lived in the 17th century, and in art history terms that means the Baroque period. And the Baroque style is characterized with words like ornate, elaborate, rich and opulent. There's swags, there's scrolls, there are acanthus leaves. You can actually see some of those on top of the pillars here in the museum. Everything that is sort of wildly growing, sprouting like this is characteristic of Baroque art. It's also interesting to note that all these elements were inspired by nature, fruit, plants, animals. And also, if you think about it, what better way would there be to represent opulence and abundance than a bunch of fruit? If you think of the horn of plenty, the cornucopia, which symbolizes opulence, it's overflowing with fruit and grain. So that is one theme that is going on at the time. I mentioned that the fruit doesn't appear in just the one work. They are all over the place. Not in his only in his wood carving either, but in his stone carving as well. There are some examples here. Just to show you, there's a couple of birds. This one is quite fun. This is in a stone carving, and it's got a lobster and a crab on it. So, like I said, it's not just fruit, it's other edible things as well. Here's an example of the kind of opulent, leafy, flowery, fruity style that is going on in all of his work, really. So one of the reasons for the fruit in Gibbons' work is that he was going with the spirit of the age and the fashion of his time. But I think in Gibbons' case in particular, there's another reason to it. And that is, I think it goes back to his origin in Holland. I'm by no means the only person who has noticed a similarity between the fruit in Gibbons' carvings and the food in still life paintings, particularly the Dutch still lifes of the period. And that is why I think it is significant that Gibbons in particular, he was born in Rotterdam. He spent the first 19 or 20 years of his life in Holland. He did his training there. We don't know where exactly he had this training. There is a theory that he worked in the Gwelling's workshop. They were famous wood carvers, Artus I and Artus II, they were cousins. For example, they did the carvings on the Amsterdam Town Hall. And one of their brothers, Hubertus Gwelling, he published a book with all the drawings of these carvings in it. So that is something Gibbon was probably aware of, even if he didn't work in that workshop himself. But if you think of the kind of workshop he would have learned in, they would have had commissions for all kinds of carved work, including frames for paintings. So that's another point where he would have been in contact with the art of his day. People didn't go to museums to view paintings like we would do today, but because of the profession he was in, he would have been aware of what was going on in the wider world of art at his time. And I think you can definitely see the influence of those naturalistic paintings in his carved fruit. There's some examples of these still lifes here. There's one, you can see the bowl of fruit there, and the crusty roll, which is so realistic that you can almost hear the crunch when you bite into it. Here's another example with plenty of fruit in it, and it's this realistic, almost hyper-realistic style that is characteristic of these paintings, and I think there's a definite echo of that in his realistic fruit. So, if there is a Dutch influence in Gibbons' work, there's another question behind that, obviously, and that is, why did the Dutch produce all these paintings of fruit and vegetables and edible things? And again, there's a twofold reason behind that. Briefly, it's down to economics and religion. There was a massive increase at the time in what we would call secular art as opposed to sacred art. That means portraits, landscapes, and the still lifes. You have to remember we had the Reformation. Large parts of Northern Europe were Protestant. And Protestantism does not promote sacred art. And even those who were not strictly puritanical, they wouldn't have favored a lot of ornament and art in their religious sphere. But they weren't opposed to art as such. They just wanted a different kind of art. And this is then where the economic factor comes in. The 17th century saw a big increase in international trade. Both England and the Netherlands, for example, had an East India Company. New trade routes were being opened to Africa and Asia. International markets opened. And with that came a rise of a prosperous middle class, the people who made their money with trade. And these were exactly the people who were the new commissioners and consumers of art. But these people, they would prefer to see something in their art which they were familiar with. They probably didn't have a classical education, so allegories or scenes from antiquity wouldn't mean that much to them. They wanted something represented that they knew, the landscapes around them, the people they saw, and the fruit that they knew. And this is why, because there is a whole new class of people who commission and consume this art. This is why there's a boom at that time in these genres of secular art. So then, is there a Dutch influence in Gibbons' work? I definitely believe so. During my research, I read an essay about Gibbons, which was entitled "A Dutch Master in England," meaning Gibbons. And I think that is probably overstating the matter slightly, but there's a definite echo in Gibbons' work of the still lives, particularly the Dutch ones. That doesn't mean to say that Gibbons set out to imitate these paintings in his carving, but he simply took on board the aesthetic and the realistic depiction of the fruit and flowers and applied that concept to his own craft. I said before that depictions of fruit are common in Baroque art, and the style as such is obviously not unique to Gibbons. But it seems that Gibbons is a particularly fine example of it. I am not an art historian, so I myself am not a judge of whether Gibbons is particularly good or not, but this is what I'm told by the experts. And even I can appreciate the skill that goes into carving something like the frame behind me. And also what I said before, if you look at his career, the people he worked for, the grand houses that he decorated with his carvings, they would bear out the fact that he is definitely on the top of his profession. It's also interesting that Gibbons is credited with introducing realistic carving in lime wood in this country, which is exactly what we see up there. The carving is of lime wood on a pine backing. And I said before he was following the art of his time, the fashion of his time, but it wasn't just that, it went beyond that. He can be seen as something of a trendsetter himself. The elaborate style he had chosen was popularized by him, and the elements, the foliage, fruit, they appear in other people's work as well, but in the specific way that he's done it, and often with elements that are typical for Gibbons, musical instruments in particular, birds, fish. All these elements together, they became known as the Gibbons style. And because of his importance, we are very happy at Abingdon Museum to have this frame, even though it is only 90% certain by Gibbons. It is definitely a really good example of what I was talking about. If you look at the fruit, look at the peach at the top, you can almost pick it off and bite into it. So it is a significant item that we have here in the museum, and we are very proud to have it. This year is the 300th anniversary of Gibbons' death, and the Grinling Gibbons Society is organizing a year-long program of exhibitions and events to mark that. And the frame with the mirror will go out on loan to be featured in an exhibition at Compton Verney entitled Grinling Gibbons Centuries in the Making. So you can see that it's not only we here at Abingdon Museum who think this is significant, but it is recognized in the sort of art world as well. And we are very happy to have such an iconic piece here. Thank you.